Mr. Widemouth, Chapter 1. The Beginning. Ethan stood before his childhood home, now worn and neglected, its windows dark like empty watching eyes. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the soft whisper of leaves brushing against the old wooden walls. Fog swirled thickly around the house, clinging to its weathered frame as if trying to shield it from intruders. Ethan felt his heart pounding, a slow, fearful rhythm that mirrored the dread pooling in his stomach. A lifetime had passed since he'd left this place, but standing here now, it felt as if time had merely folded in on itself, collapsing the years into a single, continuous moment. His hand trembled as he gripped the cold brass doorknob, feeling its icy chill seep into his bones. Each memory he thought he'd buried resurfaced, vivid and haunting. The nights alone in his room, the darkness stretching around him, and most of all, the creature with the wide, unnatural smile. The memory of Mr. Widemouth. As a child, Ethan had always been terrified of the dark. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in his room as though alive, and every creak of the floorboards was a whisper in a language he couldn't understand. And then, Mr. Widemouth had come. He remembered the first time he saw him, how the creature had materialized one night at the foot of his bed, a small, dark figure with eyes that gleamed in the dim light, and that terrible, too wide smile that stretched unnaturally across his face. "Hello, Ethan," the creature had murmured in a voice as smooth as silk, its eyes never blinking. "I'm Mr. Widemouth, and I want to play with you." Ethan shuddered now, his hand still resting on the doorknob, as he remembered that voice. It had been deep, somehow soft, yet commanding, drawing him in even as every instinct screamed at him to stay away. Stepping into the house. With a deep breath, Ethan turned the knob and pushed open the door. The hinges creaked in protest, a sound that seemed almost alive, as if the house itself recognized him and was awakening from a long slumber. He stepped inside and the musty, stale air hit him, a mixture of dust, mold, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was a scent from his childhood, buried deep in his memories, yet unmistakably familiar. The entrance hall lay in darkness, the light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. Ethan let the door close behind him, the final click echoing through the silence, trapping him inside. The floorboards groaned under his feet as he moved forward, his footsteps sounding muffled, as though the house were swallowing the sound. The stairs and his room. As he made his way up the staircase, each step seemed to carry him further back into the past. He could hear his own breathing, loud in the stillness, as he climbed toward his old bedroom. The house had not changed much, despite the years. The wallpaper still peeled in strips from the walls, and the faint scent of mildew hung heavy in the air. A cold draft crept through the hallway, brushing against his skin like the fingers of an unseen hand. Finally, he reached the door to his room. His hand hesitated, hovering over the doorknob, and for a moment, he was a child again, frightened and helpless. He could almost hear Mr. Widemouth's voice, soft and mocking, coaxing him into the games that made his stomach turn with fear. Opening the door to the past, Ethan pushed open the door, and the room welcomed him back with a familiar chill. Moonlight filtered through the cracked window, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Everything was exactly as he remembered. His small bed, the peeling wallpaper, the dresser with the mirror that had once reflected things he wished he hadn't seen. He moved into the room, his gaze landing on the far corner, the spot where Mr. Widemouth had often appeared. Even now, in the dim light, he could almost see the outline of that creature, its wide mouth stretching in a grotesque grin. He swallowed hard, the memories flooding back, vivid and sharp. Remembering the games Mr. Widemouth had been charming in his own unsettling way, he had promised adventure, excitement, freedom from the lonely, confined existence Ethan had endured during his illness. But each game he suggested was worse than the last. Ethan remembered standing on the windowsill, trembling, as Mr. Widemouth urged him to jump. "It's fun," the creature had said, its grin widening. "You'll bounce like a feather." But something in Mr. Widemouth's gaze had stopped him. A coldness, a glimmer of something that wanted him to fall. There had been other games too, games that left him with bruises and cuts he couldn't explain. He had tried to tell his parents, but they had dismissed it as nightmares or overactive imagination. But Ethan knew better. He knew Mr. Widemouth was real. Present-day fears, standing in his old room now. Ethan could feel that same fear creeping over him, as though Mr. Widemouth were watching from the shadows, waiting. He stepped toward the window, peering out into the darkened forest beyond. A shiver ran through him, as he recalled the day Mr. Widemouth had led him to the hidden path in the woods. Back then, he hadn't understood the significance of that path. He had only felt an overwhelming sense of dread as Mr. Widemouth had pointed toward it, saying, "One day, when you're ready, I'll take you to a special place." Ethan hadn't gone that day, but now, as he stared into the shadows of the trees, he wondered if he had avoided something far worse than he could have ever imagined. A presence in the darkness. A chill ran down his spine, and he turned back to face the room. And then he saw it. In the corner, where the shadows pooled thick and dark, something shifted. His breath caught in his throat as he strained to see. The air felt colder, denser, as though it were thickening with some unseen presence. A shape began to emerge from the shadows, a small dark figure with large gleaming eyes that watched him unblinking. His heart pounded, the blood rushing in his ears. He took a step back, his mouth dry, unable to look away. Then, in a voice that was smooth and chilling, the figure spoke. "Hello, Ethan." It was him, Mr. Widemouth. He was here, as if he'd never left. Ethan felt his body go rigid with fear, his mind racing with questions. How was this possible? How could something from his childhood, a figment, a nightmare, be standing before him, grinning that same terrible grin? Mr. Widemouth tilted his head, his eyes glinting with a sinister amusement. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in Ethan's mind, filling him with a dread that was all-consuming. The invitation. Mr. Widemouth moved closer, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. Ethan wanted to run, to escape the house and the memories that haunted him. But he couldn't move. He was trapped, paralyzed by the fear and the familiarity of it all. "Come," Mr. Widemouth said, extending a hand. His fingers were long and thin, almost skeletal, and his grin stretched wider, impossibly wide. "I have something to show you." Ethan felt himself step forward, as though drawn by an invisible force. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his body moved of its own accord, drawn to the creature he had feared for so long. As he reached out, his hand trembling, Mr. Widemouth's grin grew wider, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and in that moment, he realized that he was about to step into a darkness from which he might never return. Chapter 2. A warning from the past. As Ethan tries to come to terms with Mr. Widemouth's reappearance, memories resurface, blending with his present-day fears. He becomes determined to unravel the mystery of Mr. Widemouth and the disappearances linked to his childhood home. But with every new revelation, he edges closer to an encounter that might cost him his sanity or his life. Scene 1. Escaping the room suspense and rising panic. Ethan stumbles out of his old bedroom, his heart pounding, Mr. Widemouth's grinning face etched into his mind. Every shadow in the hallway seems to be reaching for him. His footsteps echo hollowly, but something else, something almost too soft to hear, follows close behind. He doesn't dare look back, fearing the creature might be lurking just a few steps behind, grinning as it once did. Detailed descriptions. Ethan's fear grows with each step, and the house feels alive, its creaks and groans like faint whispers. Shadows shift on the walls, and he could swear he hears the faint, chilling sound of laughter, blending with the noises of the house itself. Desperate escape attempt. Ethan tries to leave, but as he fumbles with the lock on the front door, the handle resists him, almost as if the house itself is holding him captive. He glances over his shoulder, convinced that Mr. Widemouth is just behind him, waiting to play one last game. Scene 2. Research and the first warning. At the library, determined to understand what happened to the other children who once lived in his house, Ethan heads to the local library. The eerie quiet of the building feels like a safe haven after the horrors of the night before. But as he delves deeper into town records, an unsettling pattern emerges. Each family that moved into his childhood home had a child who mysteriously disappeared. Adding mystery, Ethan finds scattered notes, cryptic symbols in the margins of old documents, and odd, chilling phrases such as, "The Widemouth watches," or "The games never end." Each scrap of information deepens his dread, but he's compelled to keep searching. A disturbing encounter. While scanning microfilm records, he's approached by an elderly librarian who recognizes him. She warns him in a hushed tone that some things are best left forgotten. Her eyes are clouded with fear, and she implies that the creature Ethan remembers is more than a figment of his imagination. It's something ancient, something that feeds on innocence and fear. Scene 3. Shadows in the streets. Unsettling stroll through town. That night, as Ethan leaves the library, the streets are unusually empty. The fog rolls in, thick and heavy, muffling sound and distorting shapes. Shadows seem to flicker at the edge of his vision, making him feel watched. He remembers the path through the woods Mr. Widemouth had shown him as a child, and feels a compulsion to return. Suspenseful build-up. Ethan's thoughts grow darker with each step. His reflection in the shop windows appears distorted, his features stretched and grotesque, almost as if mirroring Mr. Widemouth's wide, unnatural grin. Brief sightings of Mr. Widemouth. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan glimpses a small, dark figure at the end of the street, staring at him. Every time he blinks, the figure is gone, only to reappear in the next shadowy corner, grinning. The figure's presence becomes more oppressive, as though it's herding him toward a destination he can't refuse. Scene 4. A message from a former friend, a call in the night. At his motel, Ethan is jolted awake by his phone ringing. It's an old friend from his childhood, Michael, who had also lived in the town but moved away under mysterious circumstances. Michael warns Ethan that he knows you're back and that Mr. Widemouth has a hold over more than just Ethan's mind. He has a hold over his soul. Michael, sounding frantic, implores Ethan to leave before it's too late, telling him he never forgets a friend. Cryptic warning, Michael hints. Widemouth isn't bound to the house alone, but has a way of following those who believe in him, and that returning to the house only strengthens the creature's influence. Chilling revelation. Michael reveals that Mr. Widemouth has a history far older than Ethan realized. He recounts local legends of a demon or spirit with a wide mouth that lures children into games they never return from. The warning unsettles Ethan, but also fuels his obsession with discovering the truth. Scene 5. The woods and the forgotten path. Following the trail. Unable to ignore the compulsion any longer, Ethan returns to the forest path Widemouth had once shown him. The path is overgrown and barely visible, as though it's actively trying to conceal itself from outsiders. But as Ethan presses forward, he notices small, childlike footprints in the soil, leading him deeper. Atmosphere of dread. The deeper he goes, the colder the air becomes. Dead branches hang low, and fog rolls in like grasping fingers. He can hear faint childlike giggles, haunting and hollow, echoing through the trees. The sensation of being watched grows stronger, a weight pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. Finding evidence of other victims. Along the trail, Ethan finds eerie remnants: a child's shoe, a broken toy, and what appears to be a faded, torn-up diary page with scribbled messages. Mr. Widemouth promised, "I just have to jump. I will bounce like a feather." Each item feels like a fragment of someone's last moments before they vanished. Ratui Tamorin Scene 6. Encounter in the darkness. Mr. Widemouth's appearance. As Ethan moves further into the forest, he feels the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Turning slowly, he sees Mr. Widemouth standing a few feet away, half hidden in the fog, with that same wide, sinister grin. His eyes glint in the darkness, filled with a gleeful malice. Chilling dialogue. Mr. Widemouth speaks to him, his voice soft yet echoing, as though coming from all around. He taunts Ethan, reminding him of their games and how close Ethan came to winning. He drops hints about the other children he's played with, and as he speaks, The shadows seem to move, revealing faint, ghostly figures of children standing in the fog, watching silently. A sinister proposition. Mr. Widemouth offers Ethan a chance to finish the game they started years ago. His words are laced with dark promises, tempting Ethan with visions of freedom from his fears and a deeper understanding of the special place he'd once promised to take him to. Ethan feels an overwhelming urge to follow, but his rational mind fights against the pull. Tanz 5, Scene 7. The choice moment of realization. Ethan realizes that the path through the woods isn't a simple trail. It's a passage into something far darker. He understands now that Mr. Widemouth's special place isn't a physical destination, but a place between worlds, where innocence and fear feed a darkness beyond comprehension. Building tension. Ethan's terror mounts as he recognizes that Mr. Widemouth's influence is more profound than he realized. His memories blur with reality, and he begins to doubt his own sanity. The ghostly figures of lost children seem to move closer, their faces pale and hollow, eyes wide with the terror that froze them in their last moments. Desperate escape attempt. Ethan breaks free from Mr. Widemouth's gaze, running blindly through the trees, trying to escape the creature's laughter echoing behind him. Every step feels heavier, as if the forest itself resists him, branches clawing at him like skeletal fingers. Scene 8. Return to town. Fleeing the forest, breathless and disoriented, Ethan stumbles out of the forest, collapsing on the edge of town. The once familiar streets now feel hostile, and the buildings loom ominously, shrouded in shadow. He realizes that he cannot face Mr. Widemouth alone. If he's to survive, he must find someone who can help him understand and break free of the creature's grasp. Ending, hook. As he turns to leave, he catches a glimpse of his reflection in a store window, and for a brief, horrifying moment, his own face appears twisted into a wide, mocking grin. Beamsi. This chapter would be expanded in full by delving into each unsettling memory, building on the psychological horror and isolation Ethan experiences as he inches closer to understanding Mr. Widemouth's dark nature. Throughout the chapter, sensory descriptions of fog, shadows, and the cold silence would enhance the foreboding atmosphere, keeping readers on edge. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. Ethan's escape from the forest only intensifies his fear, as he realizes that Mr. Widemouth's presence has haunted the town and other children's lives for generations. His search for answers leads him deeper into his own past, revealing connections between his family and the creature that feeds on the fear and innocence of children. The chapter closes with Ethan teetering between terror and fascination, unable to escape Mr. Widemouth's grip. Scene 1. The dreams begin distorted nightmares. Back in his motel room, Ethan falls into a restless sleep. His dreams are vivid and surreal, pulling him back to his childhood memories of Mr. Widemouth. He sees himself as a child, playing in his old room, but shadows lurk in the corners, and he can sense Mr. Widemouth watching him, smiling that wide, malevolent smile. Sensory detail. The dream takes on a nightmare quality. Colors bleed into one another, sounds echo as if underwater, and Mr. Widemouth's soft, taunting laughter fills the space, reverberating like a haunting lullaby. Each time Ethan looks away, he sees Mr. Widemouth's face closer, his grin growing wider with each glance. Unsettling revelations. In the dream, Mr. Widemouth speaks to Ethan, his words cryptic but dripping with malice. He talks of the games they almost played and hints that Ethan left something behind, something that kept their connection alive all these years. Ethan wakes up in a cold sweat, with the chilling realization that Mr. Widemouth has never truly left him. Scene 2. An old diary returning to the library, determined to understand Mr. Widemouth's connection to the town and to himself. Ethan returns to the library the next day. He searches through the town's archives, hoping to find records of missing children or other unexplained incidents. As he scours old newspapers and family histories, he finds a reference to an old diary once belonging to a child who lived in his house long before him. Discovery of the diary. The diary is kept in a special collection due to its disturbing nature, and the librarian reluctantly allows him access. As he reads, Ethan discovers that the child wrote about a creature who appeared at night, whispering about games and secret places. The child described the same wide smile, the same malicious tone. The diary's final entry. The last page is written in frantic handwriting, with words trailing off into scribbles. It ends with a single ominous line. He promised to take me to his world, and I am ready. Ethan feels a shiver run down his spine as he realizes that this child was one of the many who disappeared, and that Mr. Widemouth has likely been haunting children for decades. Safitha Mwama, Scene 3. The Warning. A visit from Michael. Later that evening, Ethan receives an unexpected visitor at the motel. It's Michael, the childhood friend who had warned him over the phone. Michael appears gaunt and fearful, his eyes darting around as if he expects Mr. Widemouth to appear at any moment. He warns Ethan that coming back to town was a mistake, that Mr. Widemouth knows you're here and won't let you leave again. Michael's story. Michael reveals that he too was visited by Mr. Widemouth as a child. He recalls the creature's charm and terrifying suggestions, and his own narrow escape when his family moved away. But he admits that even after moving, he continued to see glimpses of Mr. Widemouth in shadows and reflections. Chilling advice. Michael urges Ethan to leave the town immediately, saying that Mr. Widemouth's power is stronger in the place they first met. He leaves Ethan with one last cryptic piece of advice. Do not follow him. No matter what he shows you, don't go. He'll make you think it's what you want, but it isn't. Michael's words linger in Ethan's mind, filling him with a sense of dread and an unshakable curiosity. Scene 4. The mirror in the motel. Paranoia and unease. Ethan returns to his room, feeling unsettled by Michael's warnings. As he paces, he catches a glimpse of his reflection in the motel mirror, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he sees not his own face, but Mr. Widemouth's wide grin staring back at him. He blinks, and the reflection is gone, but the unease lingers, building the suspense. Shadows flicker in the room, and every creak and groan of the motel seems amplified. Ethan feels as if he's being watched, as if Mr. Widemouth is lurking just out of sight. He begins to question his own sanity, wondering if Mr. Widemouth is playing with his mind. Distorted reflection. Later that night, he looks in the mirror again, and the reflection appears slightly warped, his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes dark and hollow. Panic grips him as he realizes that Mr. Widemouth may not just be in the shadows, but inside him, distorting his mind and twisting his perception. Scene 5. The Missing Children. A sinister history. The following day, Ethan visits the local historical society, where he meets an elderly volunteer who reluctantly shares the town's dark history. She tells him of the many disappearances over the years, children who vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but cryptic notes or signs of fear. Old legends. The woman speaks of an old legend that predates the town itself, a spirit or demon known for its wide, insatiable grin, luring children into the forest and feeding off their innocence. She warns Ethan that some entities can linger in a place for centuries, waiting patiently for their next victim. Finding familiar names. As Ethan studies the records, he finds the names of several children who had once lived in his childhood home. Each of them wrote about a friend who wanted to play dangerous games with them. Ethan realizes with mounting horror that Mr. Widemouth has claimed countless victims, and that he was almost one of them. Scene 6. A visit to the graveyard. The graveyard at night. Driven by the weight of his discoveries, Ethan decides to visit the town graveyard, where some of the missing children are memorialized. The fog rolls in thick and heavy as he wanders between the gravestones, his flashlight casting eerie shadows. Unsettling discoveries. He notices that several gravestones are marked with strange symbols, ones he recognizes from the diary he'd read earlier. A chill settles over him as he realizes that these symbols are connected to Mr. Widemouth, perhaps as a way to bind or summon him. Ghostly apparitions. As he walks, he catches glimpses of ghostly figures out of the corner of his eye, children with hollow eyes and pale faces, watching him from the shadows. He hears faint whispers, as if the spirits of the missing children are trying to warn him or pull him into the darkness. Scene 7. The pact to deal with Mr. Widemouth. Back at the motel, exhausted and on edge, Ethan is visited once again by Mr. Widemouth. The creature appears at the foot of his bed, grinning wider than ever. He speaks in a soft, persuasive tone, tempting Ethan with promises of secrets and powers that only he can offer. Intensifying the temptation, Mr. Widemouth implies that he can give Ethan the answers he seeks about his past, about the disappearances, and about the hidden truths of the town. But there's a catch. Ethan must play a game with him, one that would bind them together. The lure of forbidden knowledge. Despite his fear, Ethan feels drawn to Mr. Widemouth's offer. He's desperate for answers, and Mr. Widemouth's words echo with an eerie sense of truth. The creature's grin widens, sensing Ethan's hesitation, and he whispers, "Just one game, Ethan. One little game, and you'll finally understand." Scene 8. The forest beckons. The final decision. Unable to resist the lure of answers, Ethan finds himself drawn back to the forest. The fog is thicker than ever, shrouding the trees in a ghostly haze. He follows a familiar path, the one he'd taken as a child, leading deeper into the woods. Atmosphere of dread. Every step feels heavier, as though he's being pulled into a dark vortex. The trees seem to close in around him, and he hears faint giggles and whispers in the distance. Mr. Widemouth appears intermittently, always a few steps ahead, guiding him deeper and deeper. Crossing the threshold. At the edge of a clearing, Mr. Widemouth stops and beckons Ethan forward. The air is thick with tension, and Ethan senses that he's standing on the brink of something far darker than he could ever imagine. Mr. Widemouth smiles wider than ever, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, as he extends a hand toward Ethan. The choice is his. Step forward and discover the truth, or turn back and live in ignorance. Chapter 3 would end with Ethan standing at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding as he considers Mr. Widemouth's offer. The chapter would explore his fear, curiosity, and the psychological toll Mr. Widemouth has taken on him. As he faces the creature's ultimate temptation, readers are left wondering whether Ethan will resist or succumb, setting the stage for the dark revelations to come in the following chapters. Chapter 4. Crossing the Threshold. Ethan's choice to follow Mr. Widemouth into the clearing leads him into a surreal, nightmarish world where reality bends and the creature's power is at its peak. As Ethan ventures deeper, he realizes that he's not only uncovering the truth behind Mr. Widemouth's games, but also risking his soul in a place where fear feeds the shadows and memories come alive. Scene 1. The decision crossing the line. Ethan stands in the eerie clearing, fog swirling at his feet, Mr. Widemouth's hand extended toward him. He feels as if time has frozen, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His heartbeat thunders in his ears as he debates whether to take Mr. Widemouth's hand and step forward, or turn back and escape. Desperation and determination. Thoughts race through his mind, memories of his childhood fear, the warnings from Michael, and the diary of the lost child. But curiosity burns stronger than his dread. He has come this far, and he needs to know the truth. Ethan takes a deep breath, then reaches out, grasping Mr. Widemouth's hand. Scene 2. Entering the other world. The transition. The moment their hands touch, the world around Ethan shifts. Colors drain from the forest, and an unnatural chill seeps into his bones. Mr. Widemouth's grip tightens as the clearing fades, replaced by a landscape that feels both familiar and grotesquely alien. Trees twist and loom like figures with reaching arms, and the ground seems to ripple like water, pulsing with each beat of his heart, disorientation and horror. Ethan's surroundings dissolve and reform, blending fragments of his memories with surreal, distorted versions of his hometown. The buildings appear warped and decayed, as if they're alive, watching him with silent malice. Shadows seem to move independently, slithering along the ground, whispering incoherent phrases. Mr. Widemouth's game begins. Mr. Widemouth releases Ethan's hand, his grin wider and more unsettling than ever. "Welcome," he whispers, his voice echoing in Ethan's mind, to the place where games never end. Ethan's stomach churns as he realizes he's entered a world governed by Mr. Widemouth's rules, where escape may no longer be possible. Scene 3. Hallucinations and lost children encounters with the past. As Ethan explores this twisted reality, he begins to see ghostly figures, children with hollow eyes and faded forms, wandering aimlessly, their expressions frozen in fear. Each child seems to embody a memory or piece of a soul that Mr. Widemouth has trapped over the years. Their whispers fill the air, fragments of voices pleading for help, calling his name, and warning him to leave while he still can. Terrifying hallucinations. The children's appearances become more vivid, some even resembling his childhood friends. At one point, he sees a boy who looks eerily like his younger self, staring back at him with terror in his eyes. The boy's lips move, mouthing words Ethan cannot hear, and then he fades, leaving Ethan with a haunting sense of dread. A disturbing revelation. Ethan realizes that these children are the spirits of Mr. Widemouth's past victims, trapped here in a state of perpetual fear. His mind races as he questions whether he, too, will be condemned to roam this nightmarish realm if he fails Mr. Widemouth's game. Scene 4. The rules of the game. Mr. Widemouth's instructions. Mr. Widemouth appears beside Ethan, his wide grin stretching impossibly across his face. He begins to explain the rules of his game, detailing the tasks Ethan must complete if he wants to leave. His voice is soft, almost playful, but each word drips with malice. Ethan realizes that the tasks are cruel and dangerous, each one designed to test his courage and resolve. Building tension. Mr. Widemouth outlines 3 tasks, each one darker and more perilous than the last. The first is to find the Mirror of Truth, an object that will show him his worst fears. The second task is to retrieve a stone from the Valley of Shadows, a place where nightmares take form. The final task is to confront his own reflection in the Hall of the Forgotten, a place where reality unravels and time stands still. A sinister warning. Before vanishing, Mr. Widemouth warns Ethan that failure to complete any task will result in him becoming one of the lost children. He adds that the game is a test of Ethan's bravery and curiosity, hinting that he's special in ways Ethan doesn't yet understand. Scene 5. The Mirror of Truth. Confronting the mirror. Ethan's first task leads him to an ancient, cracked mirror hidden deep within the forest. Shadows cling to its frame, and the surface of the glass ripples like dark water. As he gazes into it, the reflection distorts, showing him visions of his deepest fears and regrets, moments he's tried to forget, faces of those he's lost, and the image of his own face twisted into Mr. Widemouth's sinister grin. Psychological horror. The mirror seems to draw out Ethan's fear, intensifying his emotions until he feels as though he's drowning in his own terror. At one point, he sees himself trapped inside the mirror, pounding against the glass as his reflection grins back at him with malice. Breaking free. Summoning all his strength, Ethan manages to pull away from the mirror, shattering its hold on him. He stumbles back, shaken, realizing that Mr. Widemouth's game is designed to break him mentally, as well as physically. Widemouth. Scene 6. The Valley of Shadows. Entering the valley. Ethan's second task takes him to the Valley of Shadows, a desolate, fog-filled landscape where shapes twist and writhe in the mist. Shadows of monstrous forms lurk at the edges of his vision, stalking him with silent intent. The air is thick with a sense of dread, and every step he takes feels like it's drawing him deeper into a trap. Atmosphere of dread. The Valley of Shadows is a place where nightmares come to life, and Ethan's every fear seems to take shape around him. He sees faint traces of the children who came before him, their shadows etched into the rocks as if they were burned into the landscape. Retrieving the stone. At the center of the valley, Ethan finds the stone Mr. Widemouth described, a small black rock that radiates an unnatural cold. The moment he touches it, the shadows close in, their whispers turning into anguished cries. Ethan's vision blurs, and he stumbles, barely escaping the valley as the shadows claw at his mind. But Scene 7. the Hall of the Forgotten Place, where reality fractures. For the final task, Ethan arrives at the Hall of the Forgotten, a decrepit building that seems to exist outside of time. Inside, the walls are lined with mirrors, each one showing distorted images of his life. Moments he remembers, but twisted into grotesque reflections of his fears and regrets. Reality, unraveling. As he moves deeper into the hall, he feels as though time itself is slipping away. Shadows stretch and contract, whispers echo from every direction, and he begins to lose his sense of self. He realizes that each mirror reflects not only his past, but the choices he didn't make, the paths he never took. Confronting himself. At the end of the hall, Ethan comes face to face with his own reflection, but this version of himself is different. His eyes are hollow, his mouth stretched into Mr. Widemouth's eerie grin. The reflection speaks, taunting him, saying he'll never escape. Ethan feels himself breaking under the weight of his fear and regret, but he resists, determined to maintain his sanity. Scene 8. The final confrontation. Mr. Widemouth's true form, having completed the tasks, Ethan is brought back to the clearing where he first entered this twisted world. Mr. Widemouth waits for him, but now his form is larger, more monstrous, his grin stretching unnaturally, his eyes gleaming with dark delight. He congratulates Ethan, but warns him that leaving isn't as simple as finishing the game. Moment of realization. Ethan realizes that Mr. Widemouth never intended to let him leave. The game was merely a way to test his resolve, to see how much fear he could endure. Ethan's horror grows as he understands that Mr. Widemouth feeds on fear and that the game has only strengthened the creature. Ethan's escape attempt. In a final act of desperation, Ethan turns and runs, refusing to let Mr. Widemouth trap him in this nightmare forever. The forest shifts around him, shadows closing in, and Mr. Widemouth's laughter echoes in the distance, mocking him. Branches seem to reach out, grasping at him as he stumbles through the darkness, desperate to find a way out. Chapter ending. A faint light. The edge of freedom. Just as he feels himself slipping, Ethan sees a faint light through the trees, a possible way out. Summoning the last of his strength, he races toward it, ignoring the shadows clawing at his heels, and Mr. Widemouth's voice calling him back. He bursts through the trees and suddenly he's back in the real forest, gasping for air, the cold night settling around him. Lingering terror. Ethan collapses, exhausted, but as he looks back toward the forest, he sees a shadow in the distance, watching him. He hears Mr. Widemouth's parting words echo in his mind. "I'll be waiting, Ethan. The game never really ends." A chill settles over him, and he realizes that no matter how far he runs, Mr. Widemouth will always be a part of him. Chapter 5. The haunting grip. Ethan's return to the real world offers no peace. Everywhere he goes, he feels Mr. Widemouth's presence lingering around him. Shadows take on sinister shapes, whispers fill the silence, and Ethan begins to question what's real and what's a manifestation of his fear. He realizes that Mr. Widemouth may have escaped with him, bringing the horror of his world into Ethan's life. Scene 1. Back in the real world. Fleeting relief and lingering fear, Ethan stumbles out of the forest, back in the familiar yet chillingly quiet town. He feels an initial wave of relief, but it quickly fades as he senses that something is wrong. Everything seems darker, colder, as though the veil between reality and Mr. Widemouth's world has thinned. Atmosphere of unsettling normalcy. As he walks through the town, things seem almost normal, but small details are off. Figures seem to watch him from darkened windows, and people he passes give him strange looks, as if they recognize something haunting about him. Trying to ground himself, Ethan returns to his motel room, exhausted and desperate to convince himself that it's over. He locks the door, checks the windows, and tries to reassure himself that he's safe. But he can't shake the feeling that he's brought something back with him. The Scene 2. Nightmares in the motel. Nightmares and sleep paralysis. That night, Ethan falls into a restless sleep, only to be tormented by vivid nightmares. He sees himself running through Mr. Widemouth's world again, with shadows stretching and twisting around him. In one particularly terrifying dream, he's trapped in the Hall of the Forgotten, surrounded by mirrors reflecting a monstrous version of himself, each one grinning wider than the last. Sense of paranoia and terror. Ethan experiences sleep paralysis, waking up in his bed, unable to move, feeling an oppressive weight on his chest. In the corner of the room, he sees a familiar, grinning figure watching him, just barely visible in the darkness. His heart races, but he's helpless, paralyzed as Mr. Widemouth's chilling smile grows wider. The hallucination lingers. When he finally jolts awake, the room is empty. But as he catches his reflection in the mirror, for a split second, he sees Mr. Widemouth's face grinning back. Shaken, he realizes that his nightmares are bleeding into his waking life. Scene 3. Signs of Mr. Widemouth everywhere, distorted reflections and echoes. Over the following days, Ethan becomes increasingly paranoid. He starts noticing strange, unsettling details everywhere. Reflections that don't look quite right. Shadows that seem to move on their own, and faint whispers that echo his own fears. It's as if Mr. Widemouth has embedded himself into Ethan's perception. Growing sense of dread. In the grocery store, Ethan catches sight of a small, dark figure out of the corner of his eye, watching him from the end of an aisle. On the street, he hears the faint sound of Mr. Widemouth's laughter carried by the wind. He's never able to catch a clear glimpse, but the feeling of being watched is constant, gnawing at his sanity. Eerie messages. Ethan begins finding cryptic messages in unlikely places. A note tucked into his motel room pillowcase, scrawled in a child's handwriting that says, "I'm still here, Ethan." His fear mounts as he realizes that no matter where he goes, Mr. Widemouth is following him, taunting him. Scene 4. A visit to the town's historian seeking answers from the past. Desperate for answers, Ethan seeks out the town's historian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harlan, who is rumored to know about the town's darker history. He believes that understanding Mr. Widemouth's origins might help him escape the creature's grasp, uncovering dark secrets. Mrs. Harlan is initially reluctant, warning Ethan that some things are better left unknown. But as he explains his experiences, she listens with a mix of sympathy and dread. She reveals that stories of the Widemouth demon have plagued the town for generations. The legend of the Widemouth. She tells Ethan a chilling tale of an entity that feeds on children's fear, drawing them into its world under the guise of friendship. The legend says that once the demon finds a child, it can never truly be escaped. It leaves a mark, a bond that transcends reality, and the victims are forever haunted. Scene 5. The Mark of Mr. Widemouth. Realizing the depth of his bond, Mrs. Harlan explains that those who encounter Mr. Widemouth are left with a mark, a connection that keeps him tethered to them, even if they leave the town. This mark allows him to linger in their minds, slowly breaking down their will until they're pulled back into his realm. Growing fear and helplessness. Ethan realizes that the strange occurrences, the nightmares and the hallucinations are all manifestations of this mark. He feels a crushing despair as he understands that escaping the forest wasn't the end. Mr. Widemouth's grip on him is stronger than ever. A terrifying revelation. As Ethan prepares to leave, Mrs. Harlan warns him that confronting Mr. Widemouth will only strengthen the creature's hold. She tells him of others who tried to fight back, only to vanish, leaving behind nothing but whispers and distorted memories. Scene 6. The Visitation. A midnight encounter. That night, Ethan wakes up to find his room filled with an unnatural cold. Shadows seem to pulse and shift on the walls, forming shapes that writhe and stretch. As his eyes adjust to the darkness, he sees Mr. Widemouth standing at the foot of his bed, his wide grin gleaming in the dim light. Confronting Mr. Widemouth's power, Ethan musters the courage to speak, demanding to know why the creature is tormenting him. Mr. Widemouth only laughs, a hollow, echoing sound that fills the room, and tells Ethan that the games are far from over. "You belong to me now," he whispers, "and I'll follow you wherever you go." A horrifying offer. Mr. Widemouth offers Ethan a twisted choice. He can either surrender and join the ranks of the lost children, or continue running, knowing that the creature will haunt his every step. He warns Ethan that the longer he resists, the deeper his fear will grow, making it all the more satisfying when he finally succumbs. Scene 7. Trying to escape a desperate attempt to flee. In a panic, Ethan gathers his things and drives away from the town, hoping that distance will weaken Mr. Widemouth's hold. But as he drives, the world around him seems to warp. Trees appear twisted, shadows stretch across the road, and he hears faint laughter echoing in the night. Realization of inescapability. No matter how far he goes, he can feel Mr. Widemouth's presence growing stronger, filling his mind with intrusive thoughts and images. At one point, he glances into the rearview mirror and sees Mr. Widemouth sitting in the back seat, grinning, losing touch with reality. Hours pass, but Ethan finds himself back at the edge of town, as if he's been driving in circles. Exhausted and terrified, he realizes that he can't escape, that Mr. Widemouth's mark binds him to this place, drawing him back no matter how far he tries to run. Scene 8. The realization and final descent. A moment of clarity, driven to the edge of his sanity, Ethan stumbles back into the forest where he first encountered Mr. Widemouth. He understands now that the creature isn't just haunting him, it's pulling him closer, using his fear as a tether. He realizes that if he wants to escape, he must confront the darkness within himself. Confronting his own fear. Ethan braces himself, closing his eyes and facing his fears head on. He acknowledges the terror that Mr. Widemouth has instilled in him, feeling the creature's influence pressing down on him like a weight. For the first time, he attempts to reclaim his mind, focusing on dispelling the creature's hold. The final laugh. As he opens his eyes, he hears Mr. Widemouth's laughter echoing around him, mocking his efforts. The creature's voice whispers in his mind, reminding him that fear cannot be erased, only deepened. Mr. Widemouth's parting words chill him to the core. You can't fight what you are, Ethan. You're mine, now and forever. A chapter ending, trapped in fear. The haunting continues. Ethan returns to his motel room, but he knows that he'll never truly be free. The reflections, the shadows, and the whispers will follow him wherever he goes. He's bound to Mr. Widemouth, trapped in a cycle of fear that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Lingering horror. The chapter closes with Ethan lying awake, staring at the ceiling as he hears faint whispers in the dark. His mind races, knowing that his nightmare has only just begun, that he'll spend his life on the edge of sanity, always looking over his shoulder, forever haunted by Mr. Widemouth. This chapter explores Ethan's realization that Mr. Widemouth's influence has become an inescapable part of his life. Each scene heightens the psychological horror, emphasizing Ethan's growing paranoia, fear, and sense of entrapment. The chapter leaves him in a state of haunting dread, fully aware that Mr. Widemouth will never truly release him. Chapter 6. Into the Abyss of Fear. After countless attempts to escape, Ethan realizes that Mr. Widemouth's presence is more than just a haunting. It's a dark influence embedded in his mind and soul. As he prepares to break the connection, he's forced to confront memories he's tried to bury, exploring the terrifying hold that Mr. Widemouth has over him. His journey takes him deeper into fear, blurring the line between reality and nightmare, until he faces a final choice: submit to the creature's control or find the strength to defy him. Widemouth Scene 1. The Realization. The persistent haunting. Ethan's reality has been distorted for weeks. Shadows seem to reach for him, whispers echo in empty rooms, and he feels watched wherever he goes. Desperate and losing hope, he accepts that Mr. Widemouth's hold over him is something deeply rooted, something that goes beyond fear. It's a connection built on memories and trauma. Descent into desperation. Ethan barricades himself in his room, studying the folklore and occult practices he's accumulated, seeking a ritual or method to sever this dark bond. He barely eats or sleeps, consumed by the need to free himself, aware that every passing hour only strengthens Mr. Widemouth's grip. A dark plan. Ethan decides that if he can't remove Mr. Widemouth's presence from his life, he'll try to force the creature into the open and confront him head-on. He draws symbols around the room and gathers everything he can find on banishing rituals, hoping to push Mr. Widemouth back into the nightmare realm he came from. Scene 2. The ritual begins. Setting up the ritual. Ethan's room is lit by flickering candles, casting ominous shadows on the walls. His hands shake as he draws protective symbols on the floor and sets objects from his childhood in the center. A small toy, a photograph, anything that connects him to his past with Mr. Widemouth. These items, he believes, might lure the creature into revealing his true form, building the atmosphere. The room fills with tension as Ethan begins the ritual, reciting words he found in an ancient tome, invoking protection and banishment. As he chants, the air grows heavy, thick with a cold, oppressive presence. Shadows gather around the symbols, seeming to pulse with each word, and he senses that something dark is drawing near. A mocking response. Suddenly, Mr. Widemouth's voice echoes through the room, mocking Ethan's attempts. The creature's laughter fills the air, coming from every shadow, every dark corner. "Did you think you could get rid of me?" Mr. Widemouth's voice taunts, rich with amusement. "You invited me in long ago, Ethan. I'm part of you now." Scene 3. Trapped in his own mind. A horrifying vision. Ethan feels himself pulled into a vision, his surroundings melting away as he's drawn into a twisted version of his own memories. He finds himself back in his childhood home, but everything is distorted. The walls are cracked, darkened, as though rotting from within, and the air is thick with the smell of mold and decay. Deepening psychological horror. As he walks through this warped version of his home, he sees himself as a child, frozen in fear, hiding in corners and glancing around anxiously, as if expecting Mr. Widemouth to appear at any moment. Each version of himself seems lost, hopeless, their eyes wide with terror. A terrifying encounter. Ethan turns a corner and sees Mr. Widemouth standing at the end of a long, dark hallway. The creature's grin is wider than ever, his eyes glinting with a sickly light. "Do you see now, Ethan?" he says, voice echoing. "You've carried me with you all this time. I've been waiting, watching, growing stronger." Scene 4. Confronting memories of fear. Reliving childhood trauma. Ethan is forced to relive specific memories, each one a moment when he felt Mr. Widemouth's presence but couldn't see him. He remembers lying in bed, paralyzed with fear, convinced that something lurked in the dark. He sees himself standing at the window, hearing Mr. Widemouth's voice urging him to jump, promising that he'd bounce like a feather. Unsettling encounters. Each memory feels sharper, more real, as if Mr. Widemouth is amplifying his fear. Ethan sees images of other children, pale and ghostly, each with hollow eyes, watching him with a mixture of sadness and fear, as if begging him to free them. He realizes these are Mr. Widemouth's other victims, lost souls trapped in a realm of eternal fear. The bond revealed. Mr. Widemouth appears beside him in each memory, whispering that he's been feeding on Ethan's fear all these years. The creature explains that he exists wherever fear does, that he thrives on terror, and Ethan's resistance has only made him more satisfying to haunt. Scene 5. The abyss of his own mind. A descent into darkness. Ethan finds himself in a surreal landscape that feels like a nightmare made real, a realm of endless darkness, punctuated by fragments of his worst fears. Shadows take on monstrous forms, whispering his name, taunting him. The ground shifts beneath him, a swirling abyss that threatens to pull him under. Eerie and claustrophobic imagery. Ethan feels trapped in his own mind, his fears made tangible, surrounding him, consuming him. He's forced to confront every suppressed memory, every lingering doubt, as Mr. Widemouth's voice echoes, calling him friend and reminding him that he's bound to this realm. A test of willpower. Mr. Widemouth gives Ethan a chilling choice: to surrender and let the creature take full control, or to fight against his fear, knowing that doing so may tear his mind apart. Ethan realizes that Mr. Widemouth wants him broken either way. If he gives in, he'll be another lost soul in Mr. Widemouth's collection. If he fights, he risks shattering his sanity. Scene 6. A terrifying bargain, an offer of freedom. Mr. Widemouth offers Ethan one final bargain. If Ethan willingly surrenders, Mr. Widemouth will end his torment, giving him a peaceful place within the nightmare realm. Ethan hesitates, feeling the weight of his fear pressing down on him. The creature's offer is tempting, a release from endless horror, building the tension. The darkness around him seems to close in, suffocating him. Mr. Widemouth extends a hand, his grin widening, promising that it will all be over if Ethan just takes his hand. Rejecting the offer, summoning his remaining courage, Ethan refuses, declaring that he'd rather fight than give in. The shadows recoil, and Mr. Widemouth's grin fades, replaced by a look of rage. He realizes that Ethan's defiance has weakened him, even if only slightly, and he snarls, vowing that the torment will never end. Scene 7. The struggle for control. A battle of wills. Ethan feels a surge of strength as he resists Mr. Widemouth, focusing on memories of courage and determination rather than fear. The shadows around him waver, as though his defiance is disrupting the creature's power. He sees visions of light piercing the darkness, illuminating the faces of other lost children. The power of resistance. Mr. Widemouth's form begins to distort, his grin faltering as Ethan's defiance grows. For the first time, the creature appears vulnerable, his presence flickering like a candle in the wind. Ethan realizes that Mr. Widemouth's power is tied to his submission. Without fear, the creature weakens. A moment of hope. As he fights, Ethan sees glimpses of an exit, a faint doorway, a shimmering light beyond the darkness. The children's faces turn to him, their expressions filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow, as if urging him to keep fighting. Scene 8. The escape breaking free. Summoning the last of his strength, Ethan charges toward the doorway, ignoring Mr. Widemouth's enraged screams and threats. The ground beneath him shifts and trembles as the creature tries to hold him back, but he pushes forward, driven by a fierce determination to escape. The final confrontation. Mr. Widemouth appears before him one last time, his form monstrous and twisted, his grin stretched impossibly wide. The creature lunges at Ethan, trying to pull him back, but Ethan holds his ground, focusing on the doorway and the light beyond. A shattered connection. With a final surge of will, Ethan breaks free from Mr. Widemouth's grasp, stepping through the doorway and into the light. The creature's scream fades into silence, and Ethan feels the bond shatter, freeing him from the oppressive darkness. Tsiru chapter. Ending, lingering shadows, returning to reality. Ethan wakes up in his motel room, drenched in sweat, but feeling lighter, as though a weight has been lifted. The room is filled with sunlight, dispelling the shadows that once haunted him. For the first time in weeks, he feels a sense of peace, knowing that he's broken Mr. Widemouth's hold. Hints of unease. As he leaves the motel, he glances back and sees a faint shadow in the mirror, a reminder that while he may be free, the scars of his experience will remain. He walks away, uncertain of what the future holds, but determined to live without fear, even if the memory of Mr. Widemouth's grin lingers in the back of his mind. In this chapter, Ethan confronts the darkest depths of his fear, facing the power Mr. Widemouth holds over him, and ultimately finding the strength to break free. This journey through memories, psychological horror, and supernatural confrontation offers a resolution to the bond between them, though with lingering implications that keep the reader on edge. The chapter is a blend of inner turmoil, surreal horror, and a final victory that feels both triumphant and haunting. Chapter 7. Shadows of the Soul. After escaping Mr. Widemouth's realm, Ethan tries to rebuild his life. However, he starts experiencing terrifying phenomena that lead him to question whether he's really free. He discovers that the creature's influence may have seeped into his soul, an inescapable shadow following him everywhere. His sanity erodes as he faces an agonizing choice between confronting Mr. Widemouth in a final showdown or surrendering to the darkness within. Scene 1. The False Dawn. The Illusion of Freedom. Ethan wakes up to a bright morning, feeling light and at peace for the first time since his ordeal with Mr. Widemouth. He breathes in the calm of his room, relishing the feeling of normalcy. Convinced that he's finally free, he goes about his day trying to forget the horrors he endured. Hints of darkness. Although Ethan is relieved, he begins noticing faint signs of something amiss. Strange shadows in his peripheral vision, objects in his home appearing slightly out of place, and a faint, unsettling echo whenever he's alone. He dismisses it as paranoia, but the unease lingers. Trying to move on. Determined to reclaim his life, Ethan meets up with friends, revisits familiar places, and tries to resume his normal routines. He laughs, talks, and pushes thoughts of Mr. Widemouth to the back of his mind, hoping that this peace will be permanent. But the shadows seem to follow him, lurking just out of reach. Or fast to bring up Scene 2, The Lurking Shadows. Unexplainable phenomena. Over the following days, strange occurrences disrupt Ethan's fragile sense of peace. He finds faint, childlike drawings of wide grins etched into dusty surfaces and hears quiet laughter echoing in the silence. Each night, he wakes up at precisely 3:33 a.m., feeling a chilling presence nearby. Escalating terror. The events intensify, with lights flickering at random and reflections in mirrors appearing slightly distorted. Ethan catches glimpses of movement in dark corners, as if shadows themselves are watching him. Each encounter deepens his fear, making him wonder if Mr. Widemouth has truly left. A return of the mark. One morning, Ethan notices a faint symbol on his wrist, the same symbol he saw in Mr. Widemouth's realm. Panicking, he scrubs at it, but the mark only darkens, embedding itself further. He realizes that the creature's influence might be more deeply rooted than he thought, leaving him vulnerable to Mr. Widemouth's insidious return. Wimsai. Scene 3. The Awakening of Memories. The Haunting Whispers. As Ethan tries to sleep, he hears faint whispers calling his name, seeping through the walls and echoing around him. The voices are soft yet chilling, filled with a hollow, taunting quality that unsettles him to his core. He covers his ears, but the voices seem to invade his mind, like whispers from beyond. Psychological horror. The whispers grow louder, becoming a chorus of voices chanting his name, as if summoning him. Shadows flicker across the walls, forming distorted shapes, and Ethan feels an unbearable dread as he realizes that he's not alone. A glimpse of Mr. Widemouth. In the silence of the night, Ethan looks into the bathroom mirror and sees Mr. Widemouth's grinning face staring back at him. The creature's eyes gleam with a cold malice, and his grin stretches wider, filling the mirror with an unnatural horror. Ethan stumbles back, but when he looks again, the reflection is his own. Shaken, he begins to question his own sanity, fearing that Mr. Widemouth may be merging with him. Tiskar Fanark Scene 4. Seeking help in the shadows. Turning to an occultist. Desperate for answers, Ethan visits an occultist, Mariana, who is rumored to understand spirits and dark entities. He describes his experiences, confessing his fear that Mr. Widemouth has left a permanent mark on his soul. Mariana listens with a somber expression, sensing the depth of his torment. Eerie atmosphere. Mariana's shop is filled with strange artifacts and faint, unsettling incense. Shadows seem to dance in the corners, amplifying Ethan's anxiety. Mariana warns that certain entities, especially those born from fear, can leave echoes that live within the soul, making them almost impossible to exorcise. An ominous revelation. Mariana explains that Mr. Widemouth may have become a shadow self, an imprint of fear that lingers in Ethan's subconscious. She tells him that such entities often require a final confrontation, one that could risk Ethan's mind and soul. She gives him a small black mirror, warning him that if he ever sees Mr. Widemouth within it, the creature's hold remains strong. Scene 5. The Mirror of Shadows. Strange behavior and dark urges. Following his visit to Mariana, Ethan begins experiencing disturbing behavior. He finds himself in places he doesn't remember going, experiencing memory lapses and brief episodes where he mutters in Mr. Widemouth's voice. Friends notice his distant demeanor, and Ethan fears that the creature is slowly taking control, losing control of reality. Ethan starts seeing faint visions of Mr. Widemouth wherever he goes, in reflections, dark windows, and even in crowds. He realizes that his behavior isn't his own, that he's becoming more like the creature with each passing day, as if Mr. Widemouth is merging with him. A frightening discovery. While reviewing old photos, Ethan notices that Mr. Widemouth's face appears faintly in the background of childhood pictures. Horrified, he realizes that the creature may have been with him since he was a child, lurking in his memories and shaping his fears. Scene 6. The return to the childhood house. Seeking the source of fear. Ethan returns to his childhood home, desperate to confront Mr. Widemouth and sever the bond. The abandoned house feels cold and foreboding, shadows stretching long and dark across the walls. He steps inside, feeling as if he's entering a place where time and reality no longer exist. Atmosphere of terror. Each room is filled with echoes of his past, the faint sounds of laughter, whispers, and distorted memories. Ethan feels Mr. Widemouth's gaze on him, an oppressive presence that fills the house. Shadows flicker in the corners, and the air grows colder, thick with an ominous tension. A terrifying encounter. In his old bedroom, Ethan finds a cracked mirror lying on the floor. As he looks into it, he sees Mr. Widemouth standing behind him, grinning. The creature's eyes glint with a sickly light, and Ethan realizes that the figure in the mirror is himself. Mr. Widemouth has become a reflection of his own darkness, his shadow self. Scene 7. The choice in the darkness. An offer of surrender. Mr. Widemouth appears in full form, his wide grin stretching to unnatural lengths. He tells Ethan that he can end his torment if he submits, allowing the creature to fully merge with him. Mr. Widemouth's voice is persuasive, soothing, as he promises an escape from fear and a release from suffering. Intensifying the conflict. Ethan feels the pull of Mr. Widemouth's offer, the temptation to surrender and end his pain. But he senses that giving in would mean losing himself completely, allowing the creature to consume his mind and soul. A fierce refusal. Summoning his strength, Ethan rejects Mr. Widemouth's offer, shouting that he will never surrender. Mr. Widemouth's grin falters, and the shadows around him tremble. Ethan takes the black mirror Mariana gave him, holding it up to Mr. Widemouth, who recoils at his own reflection. Scene 8. The final exorcism. Performing the ritual. Determined to banish Mr. Widemouth once and for all, Ethan lights candles and begins a ritual of cleansing. He recites words of protection, his voice steady and filled with resolve. The room fills with a bright light, the shadows shrinking as Mr. Widemouth's form begins to flicker. Climactic showdown. Mr. Widemouth fights back, his form twisting and stretching as he tries to resist the ritual's power. Shadows claw at Ethan, but he holds firm, focusing on dispelling the creature's influence. The room shakes as light and darkness collide, the air filled with Mr. Widemouth's furious screams. A final farewell. As the ritual reaches its peak, Mr. Widemouth's form begins to disintegrate, his grin stretching into a grimace of defeat. He looks at Ethan one last time, his voice a faint whisper. "You'll never be rid of me," he says, before dissolving into shadows and vanishing into the ether. The tour is seen for chapter ending. Lingering shadows. A fragile piece. Ethan stands in silence, the oppressive darkness finally lifted. The room is quiet, the shadows no longer menacing. He breathes deeply, feeling the weight of Mr. Widemouth's presence finally gone. But as he leaves the house, he can't shake the feeling that a small part of the creature lingers within him, a reminder of the darkness he's faced. Final reflection. Ethan looks into the black mirror one last time, relieved to see only his own face. But as he walks away, he senses that Mr. Widemouth may still be watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. Ethan moves forward, knowing he will carry the scars of this encounter forever, haunted by the memory of that wide, sinister grin. Outside in this chapter, Ethan confronts the lingering presence of Mr. Widemouth in a climactic battle for control. Though he ultimately breaks the connection, a sense of ambiguity remains, leaving readers questioning whether Mr. Widemouth is truly gone or if he's merely biding his time. This creates an ending filled with both resolution and lingering unease, capturing the haunting, eerie tone of the story. Chapter 8. Shadows Within. After the ritual, Ethan believes he has freed himself from Mr. Widemouth, but unsettling experiences make him question whether the entity has truly gone, or whether it's still hiding somewhere deep within his mind. Desperate for peace, Ethan embarks on a journey through his psyche, reliving memories, facing fears, and unearthing repressed trauma. With every revelation, he confronts the possibility that Mr. Widemouth is no longer a separate entity, but a twisted part of his own identity. Scene 1. False peace. The calm before the storm. Ethan awakens with a sense of newfound freedom, hopeful that his life may finally return to normal. He breathes in the quiet of his room, savoring the calm that seems to fill the air. He goes about his morning routine, feeling lighter, almost reborn. Hints of unsettling normalcy. As he prepares his breakfast, Ethan notices small, strange details, shadowy movements in his peripheral vision, brief chills in empty rooms, and a faint, almost imperceptible sound of soft laughter just out of earshot. He brushes these off, hoping that they're simply remnants of his traumatic memories, attempts at moving forward. Determined to reclaim his life, Ethan starts going back to familiar places, reconnecting with friends, and diving into hobbies. He forces himself to focus on the present, ignoring the nagging feeling of dread that seems to follow him wherever he goes. Scene 2. The return of nightmares. Disturbing dreams. Over the next few nights, Ethan begins experiencing nightmares again. Each dream is filled with twisted, surreal landscapes, places where shadows pulse and walls whisper his name. In these dreams, he sees faint silhouettes of children with hollow eyes and wide, fearful grins. Building paranoia. In one particularly horrifying dream, Ethan finds himself in his childhood home, standing in his old bedroom. Mr. Widemouth appears in the corner, watching him with a wide, sinister grin, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. The creature steps forward, and Ethan wakes up gasping, his chest tight with fear, a growing fear of sleep. As the nightmares become more intense, Ethan begins fearing sleep, dreading the inevitable return to the nightmare realm. He tries to stay awake for as long as possible, but exhaustion eventually forces him to close his eyes, trapping him in an endless cycle of horror. Scene 3. Shadows in the daylight, hallucinations and paranoia. During the day, Ethan starts experiencing disturbing hallucinations. Shadows stretch and contort into familiar shapes. Mirrors briefly reflect Mr. Widemouth's grin, and he hears faint, taunting whispers echoing in empty rooms. Each hallucination is brief, but they leave him shaken, uncertain of what's real. Sense of isolation. Ethan withdraws from friends, fearing that his grip on reality is slipping. He questions whether Mr. Widemouth has left a piece of himself behind, a shadow within his mind that he can't escape. The isolation deepens his paranoia, making him feel as though he's being haunted from within. A vision of his own reflection. One day, Ethan catches his reflection in a shop window and is horrified to see his face slowly distort, his mouth stretching into Mr. Widemouth's wide grin. He stumbles back, terrified, as the image flickers back to normal. He realizes that the creature may have taken root in his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness. Scene 4. Descent into self-doubt. Seeking psychological help. Desperate and terrified, Ethan visits a therapist, hoping to understand his experiences. He describes his memories, his visions, and his fear that Mr. Widemouth is somehow embedded in his mind. The therapist suggests that he may be experiencing symptoms of PTSD, encouraging him to confront his trauma rather than run from it. Internal conflict and fear of the unknown. Ethan considers the possibility that Mr. Widemouth is nothing more than a manifestation of his deepest fears. But as he delves into his memories, he feels Mr. Widemouth's presence intensify, as though resisting his attempts to uncover the truth. An ominous warning. During a session, Ethan experiences a sudden vision. His therapist's face slowly morphs into Mr. Widemouth's grin. The therapist warns him in a distorted voice, "You can't hide from me, Ethan. I am part of you." Ethan jolts back, horrified, and the vision fades, leaving him unsure of what he just saw. Scene 5. The journey into memory. Revisiting his past. Determined to find answers, Ethan embarks on a mental journey through his past, revisiting memories of his childhood encounters with Mr. Widemouth. Each memory is sharp and vivid, pulling him deeper into his psyche, where he faces the moments of fear and confusion that shaped his relationship with the creature, uncovering repressed trauma. As he relives these moments, Ethan realizes that his fear of Mr. Widemouth was tied to other fears, of loneliness, rejection, and vulnerability. He begins to understand that the creature may have been feeding off his insecurities, twisting them into a manifestation of terror. A dark revelation. Ethan reaches a buried memory he had long forgotten. A moment when he willingly followed Mr. Widemouth into the forest, hoping to escape his loneliness. This memory fills him with guilt and horror as he realizes that part of him wanted the creature's presence, sought the companionship it offered, even if it was dark and twisted. Scene 6. Confronting the shadow self. The mirror ritual. Following his journey through memory, Ethan remembers the black mirror given to him by Mariana, the occultist. She had warned him that if he saw Mr. Widemouth in the mirror, it would mean the creature's influence still lingered. He takes out the mirror, his heart pounding as he prepares to face whatever might appear, building tension and fear. As he stares into the mirror, shadows gather around his reflection, distorting it. For a moment, he sees himself as a child, eyes wide with fear, standing next to Mr. Widemouth, who grins down at him. The image shifts, showing his adult self with Mr. Widemouth's grin, merging the two identities. A terrifying confrontation. Mr. Widemouth speaks through the mirror, taunting Ethan, claiming that he's always been there, hidden in his mind. "You invited me, Ethan," the creature whispers, "and I'll always be a part of you." Ethan realizes that Mr. Widemouth may be an inseparable part of his psyche, a manifestation of his deepest fears. Scene 7. The choice of acceptance or rejection. A moment of desperation. Ethan stands on the brink of despair, grappling with the idea that Mr. Widemouth may never truly leave him. He feels as though he's staring into an abyss, the darkness threatening to consume him if he surrenders. Mr. Widemouth's voice fills his mind, urging him to embrace the darkness and let go of his fear. Internal struggle and tension. Ethan realizes that the only way to truly defeat Mr. Widemouth might be to accept him as part of his own mind, to confront the darkness without fear. But doing so means facing parts of himself that he's tried to bury, parts that terrify him as much as the creature itself. A powerful defiance. Summoning his willpower, Ethan shouts that he will not surrender. He refuses to be consumed by his own fear, even if it means living with Mr. Widemouth's shadow forever. The mirror shatters, and the creature's laughter fades into silence, leaving Ethan alone, shaken but resolute. Scene 8. Living with the darkness. Embracing a new reality. After the confrontation, Ethan feels a strange sense of peace. He understands that while Mr. Widemouth's influence may never vanish completely, he has reclaimed control over his own mind. The fear lingers, but he's no longer ruled by it, accepting that the shadow of his past will always be a part of him. Bittersweet resolution. Ethan resumes his life with a renewed sense of purpose, learning to live with the memories and shadows that accompany him. He understands that fear is a part of him, something he can confront without allowing it to consume him. A final glimpse. As he walks away from the broken mirror, he catches a faint reflection of Mr. Widemouth's grin in the shards, a reminder of the entity that will always reside in the corners of his mind. Ethan leaves, accepting the darkness as part of his journey, knowing he's gained strength from facing it. In this chapter, Ethan confronts the possibility that Mr. Widemouth has become a part of his identity, a shadow self that will forever reside in his mind. Though he doesn't eradicate the creature entirely, He achieves a form of victory by embracing his fears and choosing to live with the shadows rather than run from them. This ending leaves readers with a haunting, bittersweet sense of resolution, suggesting that true courage lies in facing and accepting one's inner darkness. Here's a detailed outline for Chapter 9, expanding further into the horror and suspense. This chapter will take Ethan on a journey into his own mind as he delves into his psychological struggles with Mr. Widemouth's lingering presence. Believing he had accepted and contained his fear, Ethan will confront an even darker truth. Mr. Widemouth's influence may be spreading, threatening to consume not only his mind but his entire identity. The chapter will build up to a terrifying showdown between Ethan's conscious self and the creature in an intense, internal psychological battle. Chapter 9. The Final Descent. Ethan believes he's found peace by accepting Mr. Widemouth as a shadow within himself, but as unsettling visions and increasingly disturbing behavior surface, he realizes that the creature may be growing stronger, feeding off his fear and slowly taking over his psyche. Ethan embarks on a desperate journey to confront Mr. Widemouth in the deepest recesses of his mind, facing a climactic battle that will either free him or leave him trapped in a twisted reality controlled by the entity. Chas Safras and Pabum Scene 1, Uneasy Calm. A disturbing start. Ethan wakes in the middle of the night, feeling a cold, creeping sensation down his spine. The familiar sense of Mr. Widemouth's presence fills the room, but now it's more palpable, almost as if the creature is physically there. Shadows twist and move, seeming to stretch toward him with a malicious intent. Hints of encroaching darkness. Although Ethan believes he's integrated his fears, he can't shake the feeling that Mr. Widemouth's influence is becoming more intense. Each flicker of shadow, each faint echo, feels like a reminder of something lurking just beneath the surface of his mind. Uncontrollable thoughts. As he tries to shake off the sensation, disturbing thoughts flash through his mind, thoughts that feel foreign, as if they're not his own. He hears faint whispers urging him to surrender, to give in to the darkness. Ethan's heart pounds as he realizes that Mr. Widemouth may be taking control in ways he hadn't anticipated. Scene 2. Slipping into darkness, losing time and memory. Over the next few days, Ethan begins experiencing blackouts and memory lapses. He finds himself in places he doesn't remember going, with no recollection of how he got there. Friends and co-workers notice changes in his demeanor. Moments when his voice seems different, his gaze distant and cold. Psychological tension and horror. Each blackout fills him with dread, and he starts fearing that Mr. Widemouth is attempting to fully take over his identity. Every lost moment, every strange impulse, reinforces his suspicion that the creature is trying to erase him, piece by piece. Unwanted reflections. While washing his hands, Ethan catches his reflection in the mirror and notices a twisted, sinister smile, a grin that belongs to Mr. Widemouth. Horrified, he stares as his reflection seems to warp and shift, becoming something monstrous. He hears a faint, mocking laughter echo in his mind, confirming his worst fear. Mr. Widemouth is gaining control. Scene 3. Descent into the mind. The decision to enter. Desperate to understand the full extent of Mr. Widemouth's influence, Ethan decides to attempt a meditative ritual to journey into his own mind. He prepares a space in his room, lighting candles and focusing on confronting whatever darkness lies within him. Building the tension. As he enters a meditative state, Ethan feels himself slipping deeper into his subconscious. The world around him fades, replaced by a murky, shifting landscape that mirrors the darkest corners of his mind. He senses Mr. Widemouth's presence, a lurking figure just out of sight, waiting for him. The shadow world. Ethan finds himself in a twisted version of reality, where shadows stretch across an endless horizon, and memories float like ghostly images in the air. The landscape is filled with echoes of laughter, distorted visions of his past, and fragments of his worst fears, all swirling around him. Scene 4. Confronting memories and regrets, revisiting the past. As Ethan moves through this distorted mental landscape, he encounters scenes from his past, moments of weakness, fear, and regret that Mr. Widemouth seems to have latched onto. Each memory is a reminder of a time when he felt helpless, lonely, or afraid. Sense of isolation and guilt. Ethan begins to realize that Mr. Widemouth feeds off these emotions, drawing strength from the darker parts of his psyche. As he relives these painful memories, he feels his own will weakening, as if Mr. Widemouth's presence is filling the gaps left by his insecurities. The vision of the lost children. In one particularly haunting vision, Ethan sees the ghostly figures of other children, all with wide, fearful grins. They reach out to him, whispering that they too were once friends of Mr. Widemouth. Their hollow eyes and desperate expressions make him realize that he is at risk of becoming like them, another lost soul claimed by the creature. Scene 5. A Battle of Wills. The final encounter. As he delves deeper into his mind, Ethan comes face to face with Mr. Widemouth in a desolate, dark void. The creature's grin is wider than ever, his eyes glinting with dark triumph. "Welcome home, Ethan," he whispers, his voice echoing through the void. Ethan realizes that this confrontation will determine whether he can reclaim his mind or if he'll be consumed entirely. Intensifying the conflict, Mr. Widemouth taunts Ethan, reminding him of every failure, every weakness. He tells Ethan that he's always been a part of him, a shadow born from his own fear. Ethan feels his strength waning, the weight of Mr.